Hello, I'm Walter Edgar, and welcome back to our discussion on South Carolina history. This afternoon, we're going to continue a conversation that we actually had about 2 months ago. We stopped because of a number of reasons, but we're going to pick it up with the return of the old guard. South Carolina, of course, lost the Civil War, went through Reconstruction, and in 1877, the old guard, the old political elite led by Wade Hampton, who had been in charge before the war, were back in control of state's affairs. Now, many people have talked about Wade Hampton's administration as the road not taken, while Hampton himself, as governor, pretty much tried to practice a policy of racial moderation within the context of his time. But once he became U.S. Senator very shortly, he forgot about South Carolina politics. He stayed in Washington and he tended to Washington affairs. He did not take any consideration of what was going on back here, which was not very good. But the disenfranchisement of black voters did begin during his term as governor. The General Assembly passed a new election law, redrew precinct boundaries, reduced the number of polling places, especially in black majority districts. In some districts, black voters had to travel 8 hours in order to cast their ballots. And Hampton lectured black voters on the dangers of making race a political issue. Translated, that means if you vote Republican, that's making politics out of the racial issue. However, white block voting had become the political norm. Why? From the very first time we had our conversations, demography has played a large role in the history of South Carolina. In this case, it's demographics again. The 1880 census revealed that South Carolina was 60.7% African American. Only 9 counties in the state, Anderson, Chesterfield, Greenville, Horry, Lexington, Oconee, Pickens, and Spartanburg, had white majorities. And each of those counties had a black population of at least 25%. One justification for the elimination of black voters was that the Republicans had used chicanery to keep itself in power, and now Democrats would use the same tactics. One of these, of course, was the 8-box ballot law. It originated with Edward McCready, a lawyer from Charleston. Initially, McCready had argued that only literate persons be allowed to vote, proposed a strict literacy test for voting. That did not get past the General Assembly because 22% of the white population was totally illiterate. So they would not have been allowed to vote. But they did go along with the 8-box ballot law. And this is how it worked. There were 8 constitutional offices to vote for. Each ballot box was labeled governor, lieutenant governor, secretary of state, so what have you. And voters were given 8 ballots, but they had to put the right ballot in the right box. So if you, for some reason, made a mistake and put the Secretary of State ballot in the state treasurer's box, that ballot was discarded. Registration certificate required name, address, and place of employment. And if you moved, even within the same precinct, you had to pay to get another voting certificate. And if a poor voter, and in upcountry counties denying votes to poor whites actually was fairly common, you could appeal the registrar's decision to not let you vote. The process was designed to be complex and complicated so as to frustrate the poor and uneducated. It was common practice, published in the newspapers, that poll managers bragged about how they switched boxes. You normally think, well, you start with the governor, lieutenant governor, go down. Well, all of a sudden you might find the comptroller general first. And so an illiterate voter might think that's the governor's box. So it would throw everything off. 8 ballots would get discarded. The U.S. District Attorney for South Carolina estimated that 3/4 of the state's black voters were disenfranchised. And in order to increase white power and reduce black power in terms of congressional offices, the black 7th district was created in 1882. It was gerrymandered to pack as many black voters as possible into one district. But even with that plan, 5 of the state's 7 districts had black majorities. But by decreasing the black vote, it meant sure that white men would be elected to Congress. The last African American elected to Congress was George Washington Murray of Sumter County, who was defeated for re-election in 1896. And see, that's one thing people think is, with the end of Reconstruction, African Americans went out of political office. In South Carolina, that did not happen. In some localities, particularly Georgetown and Beaufort counties, and with the black congressional district, the black 7th, as it was referred to, there was an African American in Congress until 1896. Because of a loss of political power, black Carolinians began to withdraw from public life, civic life. So you had 2 parallel societies in South Carolina by the end of the 19th century, one black, one white. And then there was a question of violence, which was prevalent throughout the state. Mobs, riots. It sounds like I'm reading the daily newspaper today. Newspaper editors were roughed up. Francis Dawson, the editor of the News and Courier, was murdered on the streets of Charleston. And later on, the editor of the state newspaper was gunned down by the Lieutenant Governor of South Carolina at the corner of Main and Gervais Streets. South Carolina's murder rate was 3 times that of all the New England states put together, and they had a population 4 times as large as South Carolina. The white minority was responsible for the largest number of killings, and their victims were mostly fellow whites. Violence was blamed on the prevalence of guns and whiskey, but it was also based upon race, and lynching was sadly fairly common in South Carolina after 1877. Another legacy of Reconstruction was that it was an insurgency, and we talked about that at in our last conversation. Because by its very nature, an insurgency makes a virtue of defying authority, and violence is considered normal. So South Carolina, as it evolved in the late 19th century, could be Exhibit A to a socially dysfunctioning society caused by insurgency. Now, what about public life? South Carolina had a public accommodations law, but it was rarely enforced. But in Charleston and Columbia, there was fairly open access, even after 1877, to theaters, restaurants, ice cream parlors, and streetcars. Black passengers who paid a first-class railroad ticket, again fairly common, was accepted the first time the General Assembly tried to segregate railroad cars in 1891 failed to pass. And the News and Courier, in a very classist statement, said, wouldn't you rather have a person of color who could afford a first-class seat than to be thrown into a car with some of those reprobates from the upstate, white reprobates from the upstate. And of course they used a pejorative term to describe the lower class whites. Private conduct, the color line was really drawn at the parlor door. There were no Jim Crow laws, but de facto segregation was already being practiced by whites and blacks. Baseball teams, fraternal organizations, religious organizations. We've already talked about, by 1866, African Americans had fled the white denominations to which they belonged prior to the Civil War. And holidays, again, looking at a black society and a white society, African Americans celebrated July the 4th, Decoration Day, May the 30th, and Emancipation Day, January the 1st. Juneteenth, that we talk about today as an African American holiday, comes later. I'm talking about African Americans and what they celebrated in the late 19th and early 20th century. Whites did not celebrate the 4th of July. That was a Yankee holiday. They did not begin to celebrate the 4th of July until about World War I. They celebrated Confederate Memorial Day in South Carolina, which happens to come on May the 10th, the date of Stonewall Jackson's death. Nobody was observing Palmetto Day. Prior to the Civil War, Palmetto Day, June the 28th, which is a celebration of the great victory at Sullivan's Island during the American Revolution, had been a state holiday. It just disappears completely. Everybody celebrated Christmas. For white Carolinians, only liturgical churches were open on Christmas Day. If you were a Baptist, you did not go to, or a Presbyterian, you did not have a Christmas service. That was papist. But if you were a Lutheran, an Episcopalian, or a Roman Catholic, yes, you observed Christmas. And not even many Methodist churches observed Christmas. Communities had Christmas trees, which were we do them today. You put something, a little circle, a little chart or ornament, and it's a child needs a pair of mittens, a child needs this, a child needs that. And commercialization was rampant. We think our ancestors might have been more religious, but there was Santa Claus, fireworks, and sales, all advertising Christmas. For African Americans, it was a very serious celebration. They had a watchfire on Christmas Eve, and as congregations, they stayed up all night singing and praying. Community and civic life was fascinating in the 19th century. There were newspapers everywhere, at least one in every county in South Carolina. The town of Orangeburg had 3, one of which was a black-controlled newspaper. Marion and Newberry had 2, and they're a tremendous source of personal news, local news, visitors, church services, fraternal organizations, weddings, funerals, family relationships. I can remember observing to folks at the state newspaper when they began to curtail the wedding announcements that you don't know what you're doing to family history. You read a small town newspaper and you see which members of the family are involved in the wedding, who were greeters, who was hosting parties, and all of a sudden you look and say, uh-oh, why wasn't the bride's aunt and uncle doing something? There's a family story there that we need to track down. Probably the most influential newspaper in the state, certainly the largest, was the News and Courier in Charleston. It's ironic that there were lots of newspapers when illiteracy was a scandal in South Carolina. Roughly 79% of the black population was illiterate and 22% of the white population. And we're talking about totally illiterate, could not read or write. Well, part of that's because of the school system. There were 3,100 schools in South Carolina in the 1890s, but only 3,400 teachers. Literally 1/3 of the schools were log cabins, log structures. One of the accomplishments of Reconstruction had been the creation of a public school system with, interestingly enough, nearly equal funding for blacks and whites. But in terms of today's dollars, we weren't spending a whole lot. On the average, in 1890, roughly $69 a student. The Southeastern average was $159, and the national average was $350. Teacher training was minimal, and supplies were almost non-existent. Private colleges in the state, such as Furman, Wofford, Limestone, had fitting or prep schools to prepare young men and women for college courses, as did African American school. Allen and Benedict had what they call prep schools or preparatory schools, or fitting schools was another term that was used. Churches were a big part of life for all Carolinians. In 1880, 91% of the population, you were either Baptist or Methodist. You put those two denominations together, and that was 91% of the population, black and white, Baptists and Methodists. Wednesday night prayer meetings, all-day services, revivals, camp meetings, campgrounds. Still prejudice against Roman Catholics. In 1880, there was an attempt to build a Roman Catholic church, and that almost caused a riot. But there was a civic religion that emerged in South Carolina, and that was what today we refer to as the lost cause. And one of the heroes, at least in terms of poetry, of the lost cause was Henry Timrod, who'd been a poet. He wrote this, it's actually our state song, Carolinas. His poem is set to music. And it's got 7 stanzas. I'm not going to read all 7. I'm going to read the last one. Girt with such wills to do and bear, assured in rate and mailed in prayer, thou wilt not bow thee to despair, Carolina. Throw thy bold banner to the breeze, front with thy ranks the threatening seas, like thine own proud armorial trees, Carolina. Fling down thy gauntlet to the Huns and roar the challenge of our son from the guns, then leave the future to thy sons, Carolina. You know what the sad irony of that is? He wrote this before the Civil War. And leave the future to thy sons. And the white population, the white male population in South Carolina, between 18 and 21,000 young men between the ages of 18 and 45 were killed. It's roughly 30% of the eligible white male population. So leaving the future to, there were not that many sons for whom there was a future. And thousands more literally crippled for life. Today, we refer to it as PTSD. But you can read letters. Uncle Jack came back from the war and he was never the same. Or Daddy took to the bottle after the war. All symptoms of post-traumatic stress. It's been investigated, by the way, for the Union Army and found tremendous cases, but that's because the federal government offered facilities for Union Army veterans. We did have Confederate homes here, but nobody was keeping a record of why people were there or what the issues were. Most historians trace the development of the lost cause to 1875 and a dedication of the Stonewall Jackson Monument in Richmond. But it actually began here in South Carolina as early as 1867, when the citizens of Sherall, the ladies of Sherall, elected a monument. That's the oldest Confederate monument in the United States, in the little town of Sherall. In 1871, there was an address by the Reverend John L. Girardeau at Magnolia Cemetery in Charleston for the reinterment of Carolinians killed at Gettysburg. And it included such phrases as, "Let us cling to our identity as people. We must ensure that the precious blood was not spilt in vain." Now, this is at the height of radical Republican power, as South Carolinians, white Carolinians referred to it. But again, this is prior to the official start in 1877, or the recognized start of the lost cause. It's already running here in South Carolina, and I think demographics, again, has something to do with the percentage of young men who were killed or maimed or came down with PTSD everybody had a husband, a friend, a brother, a father, a son that was affected by the war. The Reverend Mr. Girardeau encouraged everybody to wear mourning as long as the radicals were in power in South Carolina. And he said we need to create peculiar customs and organizations to help perpetuate the past. Set aside days of remembrance, form memorial associations, collect and publish materials for our own history, and educate our young by making our nurseries, schools, and colleges channels for conveying from generation to generation our own type of thought, sentiment, and opinion. Principle, he said, is more important than material success. Tenaciously hold on to the fragments of a noble past. That Gettysburg, those who died there, would not have died in vain, but fought for a defeated, not a wholly lost cause. And those are his exact words, the lost cause. Within a decade, all of the above was implemented. Monuments in courthouse squares, the terms relic and shrine appeared to older structures and items, especially those associated with the war. Now, age was not necessarily important. In Columbia, for example, Trinity Church had survived Sherman and was the oldest church building in the city. It was referred to thereafter as Old Trinity or Dear Old Trinity. And every town had its equivalent. Almost all of Charleston became a shrine to the past, the Holy City. The Confederate monument on the State House grounds was erected in 1879. The most expensive, though, was the Calhoun Monument in Charleston, dedicated in 1887. The initial monument was replaced by the one that was just taken down this spring. The first monument had Calhoun in a toga seated, and it was subject to abuse by the black population of Charleston, and so it was replaced by the statue on the tall column that the city of Charleston removed earlier this summer. In terms of the economy, it was in shambles. Family budgets, and I'm doing this in, again, today's dollars. The family budget for the Palmers of Mount Pleasant was $382.35. 57% of that was for rent, 22% for washing, 10% for fuel, 10% for health. This is a monthly budget. That's today's $382. Now, 10% was for the help, and there was a little left to live on. Elsie, the help, was lucky to get $36 per month to live on. In 1890, a sharecropper would be lucky, a white sharecropper would be lucky to clear a little over $1,000 for a year's labor. Increased cotton production resulted in lower cotton prices. The opening of the Suez Canal enabled rice from Burma to flood European markets. In 1864, South Carolina had produced more than 9 million pounds of rice. In 1880, we were still the leading rice producer in the U.S., but production was down to about half that. By 1890, it had dropped to 30 million pounds and was surpassed by Louisiana. Today, Arkansas is the leading rice producing state in the United States. Interestingly, one of the most interesting exports that South Carolina developed in the late 19th century, in Edgefield County, okra was grown as a commercial crop, but not for food. It was exported to the West Indies for fiber. Just one of those interesting things one finds when you start digging around. Charleston was a decaying port. Its leadership was old, unimaginative, unpaved streets, open sewers, polluted drinking water, 7,000 open privies, And in the downtown area, some of those were 2- and 3-story privies. I don't even like to think about. Be glad you didn't live on the first floor. In 1800, it had been the 4th largest city in the country. By 1890, it had fallen to 68th. Northern railroad interests took over South Carolina railroads and siphoned off the commerce. It was cheaper to ship a bale of cotton from Abbeville, South Carolina to New York City than from Abbeville to Charleston because of the railroad rates. And then to throw in natural disasters in Charleston, the hurricane of 1883 and the earthquake of 1886. Bourbon, South Carolina, which came into existence after the end of Reconstruction, the old guard in power. White Carolinians clung to their identity as a people, and in their own way, so did African Americans. We've got that parallel society. Family mattered more than money. Blacks were subordinated to whites and marginalized politically. The past was celebrated and the present ignored as much as possible. This Bourbon world or worldview was created in post-Reconstruction South Carolina and was durable enough to survive with some modifications the challenges of Ben Tillman, the New South, and most of the 20th century. Now, what about these political leaders? All Bourbon governors were in agriculture, but their public addresses sound as if South Carolina farmers were living in a promised land. In 1882, Governor Johnson Haygood said South Carolina was happy and prosperous. Well, this is on the heels of the 1881 drought and infestation of army worms that left most farmers in the state devastated and destitute. In 1882, the citizens of Mechanicsville in Sumter County were in actual want of bread and petitioned the General Assembly for relief to keep from starving. In 1886, another 4 years of drought and poor prices, Governor John P. Richardson said, "All over our fair and lovely state, with few exceptional localities, the sun of prosperity seems once again to have risen from the dark clouds that have for so many years been obscuring its rays, to shed abroad fresh and invigorated life." Bourbons had no other policy than to make South Carolina safe for white man's democracy. No leadership, no ideas, no vision. After 1882, their main purpose was to remain in office. They considered it their due, but as we'll find out later, it was to be their downfall. Thank you very much, and I look forward to being with you next week.